The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. It's official. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is going to be the running mate of Vice President Kamala Harris as they go up against Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Now, you may have just asked yourself, who? And it's what a lot of Americans are probably thinking too. In this chaotic election cycle, Walz emerged in the last few weeks as a frontrunner for the VP pick. He's a folksy Midwestern Democrat, and he's managed to win support with progressives and establishment politicians alike. In his state, he increased taxes on corporations, passed free school lunch, protections for transgender youth, and a law that would move all of the state's electric grid to renewable energy by 2040. And he did it with a razor-thin Democratic majority in the legislature. But is that the whole story? Today on Lever Time, I sit down with veteran political reporter Ryan Grimm to get a sense of who Walz is and how he's managed to find broad appeal in a fractured Democratic Party, and whether this guy is the real deal or not.
What's interesting about Tim, and one reason why he's a successful politician, he's not a career politician. He was for many years a teacher, high school teacher in the small city of Mankato, Minnesota, which is in southern Minnesota. He was a teacher. He was the football coach there. He also was in the National Guard, and so he's a veteran. And he decided to run for Congress, actually, in the 1st Congressional District, kind of a red district, in 2005, after the re-election of George Bush.
Jeff Blodgett is a former aide to Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone, and someone who's known Tim Walz for over a decade.
Minnesota was in a tough place. We had lost Paul Wellstone to the plane crash a couple years before that. People felt like the state was moving in a pretty conservative direction, and was the country. And Tim Walz felt compelled to step up and run. So he's a very authentic guy. He has a blue collar vibe to him. He is someone who I would consider a progressive populist, in that his emphasis is always on the economic concerns and circumstances of working people and middle class families. Everything he does is really focused on that set of issues for the most part, and has been tremendously successful.
Jeff knows well where Walz learned how to be a campaigner, because he was partially responsible for helping him launch his political career.
I worked for many years for U.S. Senator Paul Wellstone, and when we lost him in a tragic plane crash in 2002, a number of us created a training center to help spur on others to step up in Paul Wellstone's footsteps. So we created something called Camp Wellstone, which was a training center for people involved in politics and public life. And one of the tracks in that camp was a candidate track. And Tim Walz showed up as a participant in Camp Wellstone in January of 2005.
A big part of Walz's appeal is his ability to be a good messenger. In the last several weeks, Walz earned national attention for the TV hits he was doing. Here he is on MSNBC, for example, a couple weeks ago.
What I know is that people like J.D. Vance know nothing about small-town America. My town had 400 people in it, 24 kids in my graduating class, 12 were cousins, and he gets it all wrong. It's not about hate. It's not about collapsing in. The golden rule there is mind your own damn business. Their policies are what destroyed rural America. They've divided us. They're in our exam rooms. They're telling us what books to read. And I think what Kamala Harris knows is bringing people together around the shared values, strong public schools, strong labor unions that create the middle class, healthcare that's affordable and accessible. Those are the things. You look what they're talking about, they went right to division.
We forced people to do a 2-minute stump speech, and he clearly was someone who was going places. He had an authenticity about him. He had a charisma about him. He had an ability to connect with people that was obvious from the start. And so all the kind of elements involved in running for office, especially in an area that isn't particularly blue.
Hi, my name is Tim Walz, and I'm running for Congress here in southern Minnesota for several important reasons. But today I'd like to tell you about one issue that's very personal to me. I am a retired Command Sergeant Major in the Minnesota National Guard, and after years of firing artillery, I sustained severe inner ear damage. Because I have good health insurance provided through my employer, I was able to have surgery on my ear. As my ear healed, my hearing was gradually restored. One morning, several weeks after the surgery, I awoke to a sound I couldn't identify. I asked my wife what I was hearing, and she told me, "Tim, that's your 4-year-old daughter, Hope. You see, Hope wakes up singing every morning," but I had never heard that sound until that day. I'm running for Congress because I believe we as a country have a moral obligation to ensure that every father can hear his daughter sing, that every citizen receives the best care our medical community has to offer. I'm Tim Walz, and I approve this message because I've heard how important healthcare is to everyone.
He was running in the 1st Congressional District. And so, as a Democrat, he had to show that he was actually someone who people believe knew their lives and connected well with what they were going through as they live their lives in the 1st Congressional District. And so that's what I met him. He was fun and funny, so easy to get along with. And he went on to win that race.
Eventually, Walz becomes governor of Minnesota, which he is right now, and he's at a pretty remarkable record. With a narrow majority in the state house and a split Senate, Walz has signed into law a liberal wish list of legislation, including legalizing marijuana, restoring voting rights to felons, and creating a paid family and medical leave program. But I wanted to know from Jeff, what's his deal? What motivates Walz, and why does he believe in this stuff?
He's a teacher. And so pretty much everything he talked about had to do with education and the importance of investing in education as a way of people advancing in their own lives and their own careers. He actually has done a lot around workforce development and job retraining and community colleges and some of the non-traditional paths where people are trying to advance themselves through education as a way of moving up in kind of the job structure. But generally education. And it was about the kind of future that families wanted for their kids, whether kids were going to have the same opportunities. One other thing, though, I think that had to do with why he was chosen in the end. And I think it really came down to personal connection with Harris. Because when you sit down with Tim Walz, you can't help but like him. And he has a charisma about him and a genuineness that you are attracted to right away. He's also interested in you, though. He asks questions of other people. He wants to know about your lives. He remembers people and their stories, and all that stuff is, part of his ability to kind of ground what he does in real people and their stories and their lives. And I think that Harris obviously connected with that, and that may have been the deciding factor. I don't really know, but I'm guessing that had something to do with it.
So now we know a little bit about who Tim Walz the man is, but what about Tim Walz the politician and potential vice president? After the break, I'll sit down with Ryan Grimm to unpack Walz's record and the factors that led to his ascent as the VP nominee. We'll be right back.
When you wake up in the morning and see the recent headlines about the Supreme Court,
a judicial decision sparking a political eruption,
I'm guessing you feel overwhelmed and bewildered.
The Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade.
Well, it's terrifying. I don't know what's next.
You hear about the court helping corporations trample your long-standing rights.
This is a sweeping decision by the Supreme Court to overturn the Chevron precedent.
What this does is it ends 40 years of regulating big business.
You hear about the justices making it literally legal to bribe politicians.
In a 6-3 opinion, the court ruled that gifts to public officials can only be considered illegal bribes if they're given before the official act.
It seems like every few months the Supreme Court makes it easier and easier to bribe government officials.
You even hear about the Supreme Court actually declaring that the president does not have to follow the law.
It's the first time the Supreme Court has ruled that former presidents can be shielded from criminal charges.
In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law.
As you're doom scrolling, do you ever stop and ask, what the actual is going on? And how in God's name did we get here? Well, we have an answer for you. It wasn't a random coincidence, and it wasn't just by chance. What's happening right now is the culmination of a very deliberate and very secret scheme, executed by specific people with specific goals. I'm David Sirota. As a longtime journalist and author, I've spent decades working in and covering American politics. Our team of reporters at The Lever is about to expose the never-before-reported details of this plot in our upcoming new investigative podcast series, Master Plan.
They are actually trying to open our political world to right-wing dark money.
Something very weird is going on.
That doesn't fly. It's got to be money.
Where's all this money coming from?
We've spent 2 years reporting this story, so you're not going to want to miss it. Go to masterplanpod.com to sign up to be the first to get the series when it launches in August. You can also find the trailer and subscribe to the podcast feed right now by searching Master Plan in your podcast app.
10 years ago, Iowa and Minnesota were like indistinguishable when it came to forecasting who was going to win their electoral college votes, the governor's office, the Senate seats.
Ryan Grimm is a political reporter and the co-founder of Drop Site News.
Not long ago, Minnesota went blue in a trifecta, but just by thousands of votes, like just the narrowest of margins. Iowa went red initially by very, very narrow margins. And in both states, the people that came to power actually governed in like a serious way and enacted their respective agendas. Iowa is like now an extreme right test case for right-wing policy. And Minnesota is the opposite for progressives. Like they drove through with this very slim majority, just an extraordinarily progressive agenda. And so they took that mandate, and an old school Democratic blue dog governor would have said, we need to govern accordingly and not pretend like we have, some giant mandate for progressive change. And we need to ask the Republicans what they want out of this government. And they didn't really do that. Instead they said, look, we've got power here, and these are the things that we believe are popular. We're going to enact them, and we're going to run on them. And they did that. And it's kind of unique almost around the country.
Yeah, I think for a lot of Democrats that I talk to, and again, this is people who are moderate, this is people who are progressive, they just like this idea of standing up for what you're going to do and fighting for it. And there has been a lot of criticism from voters, not necessarily consultants or whatnot, that Democrats always seem to go behind what is popular policy. And I'll use Roe v. Wade as one example. And yet the leadership can sometimes be so slow to just take the W and say, look, this is an issue. A lot of people pointed at Biden. I think he came out a week or two after the decision with sort of first he had a bland statement, then he had not that charismatic of an address about it. And in Minnesota, I think a lot of people were just jazzed that it's like, look, they passed good policy, and they're not shy about that. They're going to go out and they're going to champion that. Another thing I wonder with Walz, and I'd wonder what you think about this, is that it feels like he's kind of this return to this democratic, almost prairie populism, if you will. I think John Tester from Montana is like that. Russ Feingold, who was another Midwestern Democrat. Paul Wellstone, who's from Minnesota, has passed away now. But this used to be what felt like a big part of the Democratic Party's base, is these rural populists. They had believed in legislation like what Minnesota has passed. They socially were, moderate. Some of them may have been religious, but it was really speaking to that rural areas. And ever since really like Clinton and Obama, the Democratic Party feels like it has gone mostly towards college educated voters, people working in high finance, Silicon Valley. And this feels like kind of he could be a bridge back to there. What do you think?
Yes, except for the social stuff. So he also enacted a pretty sweeping kind of social agenda. Trans protections, Minnesota's party, interestingly, is called Democrat Farm Labor Party, DFL. Like it's
that's
not
right.
even the Democratic Party. It's a coalition of these different parties that came together during the populist era. Now, obviously, it's just the same now. It's just kind of a name at this point, and Republicans are dominant now in the rural areas, and Democrats are dominant in the urban areas. And Walz was kind of one of the last kind of holdouts from that era. But he passed a pretty, he codified Roe v. Wade, into law, and also passed, the generally kind of sweeping social stuff. So yes and no. Like it doesn't actually rely on the kind of social conservatism that some of the left-wing populism does. Like some of the like South American left-wing populism comes with like pretty extreme social conservatism. Rooted in like Catholic, like Rafael Correa in like Ecuador. Yeah. It's like anti-abortion, for instance.
Yes.
But like, super left-wing on economic issues.
Right, like free food for people and anti-starvation policies.
So that's a different kind of left-wing populism that we don't really have that here. It seems like the kind of social liberalism and the economic populism goes, with him at least, goes hand in hand.
Well, I want to give a plug to your book, The Squad, AOC, Hope, and the Political Revolution, because you talk a lot about how identity politics can kind of roil the Democratic Party. And it went from something that had united a lot of progressives and moderates at first to something that started to sort of divide and get in the way. When you think about how Walz is as a campaigner and as a messenger within this sort of moment of identity politics, and, I should say for those listening, you read a lot in the book about how things like identity started to fracture portions of the Democratic coalition. There were fights over identity politics and the way to go about that. But then you have someone like Walz, who's this, for lack of some better descriptors, he's sort of an average, bland-looking white man, but he's pushing forward things like trans protection laws. Does that seem like a way to kind of right the ship and unite that coalition again?
Yeah, and it only really could happen through affirmative action, basically, right? That once Kamala was named, was anointed as the presidential candidate, you had all those memes that were like, it's gonna be a white guy, and Harris was like pretty clear, like, here's the list, and Whitmer took her name out. Raimondo was getting vetted. I don't believe that was really serious in terms of a vetting. I think it was more of a play for Gina Raimondo to maybe be Treasury Secretary under Harris. But in general, it's a whole bunch of bland white guys that were getting nominated, which is its own form of identity politics. Like
it totally is. Yeah.
People forget that is like Trump is like, does identity politics. Just he does a different kind of identity politics, or for a different identity. But yeah, I do think the Democratic Party was headed in a direction that was going to cost it serious, that was continuing to cost it seriously with white men. And there are an enormous amount of white men in this country, and a huge portion of them are gettable as Democrats, that they are Walz types of people, that they're not, they're bathed in this society that we live in. And so a lot of them are going to have some of the prejudices that they were raised with around sex, race, gender, you name it. But they're not lost causes, and they are good people who you can reach with good values. But you have to try. And for a while, it looked like Democrats were going to stop trying. Like, I don't know if has Justice Democrats ever endorsed a white guy? Like,
I don't know
anywhere.
But I think what you're speaking to is, I remember seeing this clip.
Bernie, I guess they endorsed Bernie in the presidential.
Yeah,
but,
they did endorse Bernie. But what you're talking about is exactly what I saw. There was a clip that was going around where he was talking about J.D. Vance, but he was talking about his hometown, and he was speaking to Vance's kind of pro-natalist, people should have children to further the cause of the country kind of stuff. And what he said was, in his rural hometown of 400 people, the golden rule is mind your own business. And that seemed to kind of encapsulate everything from, race to LGBTQ rights to basically saying, listen, our hometown rural values are be whoever you want to be. We're not going to bother you. And, and that was kind of speaking to things that I've heard more out of, like, I used to live in Boston, so I'd go into New Hampshire a lot. You'd hear people in rural New Hampshire who socially were kind of liberal, but they didn't want to say it exactly like that. They really did cloak it. I shouldn't say cloak, but they really did say it in that kind of language, which is, we respect you to do what you want. We're going to do what we want. And we don't think the government should have any role or whatnot over this.
As long as you're not hurting anybody and you're not bothering me.
Exactly.
And it's none of my business.
And I think that is something that Walz as a messenger has been able to do very well, in a way that a lot of the more left and progressive Democrats have sometimes not been able to thread that needle quite in that, that sense. One issue I want to talk a lot about is Israel. I know with Josh Shapiro, there was a lot of concern, in some cases anger, over the potential decision that he could become the vice president. A lot of stuff was coming out there about pro-Israel comments, that he had done a volunteer service in Israel in high school, and that he had once compared campus protesters to the KKK. Now, I want to be very careful with that one, because I know that you just looked at the actual quote itself, Ryan. So could you talk a little bit about what Josh Shapiro said about campus protests? And then more broadly, can you unpack some of the criticism Shapiro was getting around Israel in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, and so the precise quote was in this interview with Jake Tapper. And if you watch the interview, he's trying to defend the right of protesting in general.
Certainly students and others have a right to peacefully protest in adherence with university policy and the laws of the city and the states they're in. I think what's important is that we can't allow peaceful protest about a disagreement on policy happening in the Middle East to be an excuse for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia on these campuses. We can't allow it to be an excuse that puts certain students at risk to be able to go to classes safely or to be able to worship safely.
And Jake's kind of cutting him off.
How is it out of control? I mean, there are lines. Everybody, it's so subjective. Everybody has their own view. Somebody holds up a sign. I saw one at University of Texas earlier today that said something about Palestine, and it's a map of all of Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza, as if that is all Palestine. Does that cross a line? Some Israeli might say, you're saying that Israel shouldn't exist anymore.
The key quote that really landed him in a lot of trouble later, and not much later, was
students shouldn't be blocked from going to campus just because they're Jewish, or learning in a classroom as opposed to being forced online because they're Jewish. It is simply unacceptable. And you know what? We have to query whether or not we would tolerate this if this were people dressed up in KKK outfits or KKK regalia making comments about people who are African American in our communities. I'm certainly not condoning that, Jake, by any stretch. But I think we have to be careful about setting any kind of double standard here on our campuses. We got to call it out for what it is, and these university leaders have to make sure there is order on their campuses.
And you and I were talking about this before the program. We actually wouldn't need to query that. I think. We just go ahead and say that we're actually not gonna tolerate that. Although, it does raise those ACLU questions about the right of the Klan to march in Skokie or wherever the hell it was. Which is like, okay, fine, that's one thing. But the other point that he made in conjunction with this was, like, if the Klan was then like not letting black people onto campus or letting Jewish people onto campus, then obviously that goes well beyond this question of speech, even if it's deplorable speech.
Right.
We don't allow that. And he was speaking about either hypothetical or real situations, because there were some situations that seemed to get kind of blown up on social media that then when you looked into them, that wasn't actually what was going on. But there were allegations that Jewish students couldn't get into libraries or couldn't get onto campus and that were being blocked. And that, I think, actually everybody agrees, no, that's not okay. Like that isn't free speech, and not defensible for no matter what your cause is. But the use of the phrase, KKK outfits or KKK regalia in the context of these protests, I think just politically was a mistake. And one of Shapiro's real calling cards is that he's an extremely deft politician, and I think he should have known how that would be received by the people who were protesting. The timing was brutal for him on multiple levels. For all the campus protests to be happening right before this, and considering how he responded. So he endorsed a bill in the Pennsylvania legislature that would have, I think, defunded college campuses that didn't kind of crack down sufficiently on these protests. So that combined with this other remark, had people worked up. Like what's this is like this guy seems like an enemy is how it was received. But it's interesting. This is meta stuff that none of this is about Israel Palestine. This is about, which is classic American way to talk about global affairs, is to make it about us.
Right.
Nothing we have said has touched Gaza yet. This is
yes, that's true. It's all about inside the U.S.
Inside the U.S.
protests,
how you responded to protests on campuses about that. Yeah. The other brutal timing for him was the Pennsylvania Supreme Court taking up this, this weird murder-suicide case involving people that he knew. I think that was absolutely crushing timing for him. But back on the question of Israel-Palestine, one thing I do think people missed, I think people were too quick to assume what his position would be, particularly on Israel-Palestine, based on things. Now, I understand why they're upset about what he said about the protesters and endorsing the bill about boycotting the protesters. But the things that were getting circulated were, I think, a 2012 appearance he made at an AIPAC, at an AIPAC conference, and praising Joe Lieberman. Like any Democrat is doing that in 2012,
right?
And I think in 2014 he or something around maybe 10 plus years ago, he said something nice about a Netanyahu speech at the United Nations, not the one he gave against Obama's wishes here in the U.S. And then also when he was in college, they found a paper or some statement that he put out. Maybe it was a college essay or a college newspaper article or something, saying that Palestinians are too battle hardened to make peace, a kind of a racist thing, which he said, look, I was 20, and he kind of distanced himself from. But that goes back to the bad luck that he was facing. On the one hand, he's saying that he's 20 and should be forgiven for making a racist comment about Palestinians. At the same time that he's really ramping up his outrage at 20-year-olds on college campuses. Yeah,
that's a very good point. I did not actually think of that kind of contrast over there.
But I think that what people miss is that they assumed too much about this service, this volunteer service that he did in Israel with the IDF. He puffed it up. He did not volunteer with the IDF. He did a typical thing that you would do at a Hebrew school, where they send you to Israel and you fold clothes and
you work on a kibbutz,
work in a garden. Yeah. And then you puff it up later to say what you did. But basically everyone that grows up in that suburban Jewish community in Philadelphia is going to do that.
Sure.
That you can't really, I don't think, read into that anything about how he's going to govern on Israel-Palestine. And I had made the argument that people misunderstood, I think, that there was, and there still is, because we haven't heard the last of Shapiro for sure. And in fact, if Harris and Walz lose, like he's a front runner, next time around, if Democrats are ever going to break from their current Israel policy, it would take somebody with Shapiro's credibility,
right,
to be able to do it. And I think that's a pretty straightforward and obvious point.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean he's definitely going to do it.
Well, it's sort of like how Lyndon B. Johnson was the guy to really get civil rights passed through.
That's
he
a great example. Yeah.
White Texan and someone who had really allied with the racist Democrats earlier in his career.
Really well. That's really well put. Kennedy was never going to get that through.
Right.
Like the history is clear on that. Like that thing was dead. And maybe eventually 5 years later something goes through. But yes, very very good point. And people always say that Nixon goes to China, but I think LBJ doing the Civil Rights Act is an even better example. And at the time, if anybody would have said that about LBJ in 1960 when JFK was picking him to be his vice president, they would have been just as relentlessly mocked as I was when I said that about Shapiro.
Right.
And for good reason, because they could point to, like, this guy drops the N-word 7 times a day.
Yeah, I mean, he had literally nuked a civil rights bill and then watered it down in the 1950s.
Just 3 years earlier.
Yeah.
Right. So the people's skepticism would have been warranted. But the forecast would also be like it's a possibility. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. And it required all of the civil rights movement to push him there. He wouldn't have done it on his own. That's absolutely for sure. But so the combination of those things, a groundswell of public support, plus his credibility on the issue. And when I say credibility, it's like people would say, "Oh, well, look at this other pro-Israel thing he did." It's like, no, that's where the credibility comes from.
Right. It's to assuage. It's not the critics of Israel that need to be assuaged. It's the people who are worried that things went too far. And I should say that I think that in the scope of what happened in the country, that was a fair concern if you're someone who wants to get reform on Israel policy, is that maybe the protests were starting to get a bad characterization with, your standard fair voter, your suburban parents who are just watching what's happening on TV. In the flip side, though, so
right,
Tim
and
Walz,
they're not blameless. Like, there's obviously stuff you can criticize.
Yeah, absolutely. On the other side, Tim Walz, Democratic majority for Israel's leader, Mark Mellman, he writes that Walz is a strong pro-Israel Democrat, puts out a statement that seems pretty happy. Walz has spoken at AIPAC conferences. He's met Netanyahu. Do you see a difference between Shapiro and Walz in how they've talked about Israel or its policies? And could Walz potentially be that same messenger, that LBJ-style person that can say to moderates or people who are uncomfortable with how the far left has gone about Israel that, listen, there's a real need to reform what's happening? And I should say that's only going to happen if Kamala Harris actually wants to make a break with Israel. That's another 4-hour discussion I'm sure that we could have. But let's say in this hypothetical that Harris is open to it, and now you got to convince everybody else.
Right. And we could cut the 4-hour conversation down to 1 minute and be like, she probably doesn't. Like, now she's probably not as lockstep as Joe Biden, who had a real ideological locked in position, where I think both Walz and Harris will be more pragmatic and malleable about it. If it's beneficial to them and to the U.S. interests, then they'll move in that direction. If it's not, then they won't. But I don't think that Walz has the same room to maneuver when it comes to Israel Palestine, because he's just as vulnerable to. I mean, they call Bernie Sanders anti-Semitic during the
who had also gone to a kibbutz in the 60s and volunteered.
Yes, yeah, right, exactly. What endeared him was, again, meta stuff in the sense that when he was asked during the Minnesota primary about the uncommitted vote, he spoke very warmly of those organizing and supporting that vote, and said that they needed to be taken seriously, that what they were doing was the right thing, that they saw a catastrophe unfolding and were working to end it, and were doing it through the process. So I think that kind of heartfelt statement kind of overrode a lot of the other very standard kind of democratic stuff that Walz had done on Israel. Mark Kelly, I thought, was a better example of a double standard. Like Kelly, straight up, after applauding for Netanyahu, who Josh Shapiro called the worst leader of all time, he then told reporters that perhaps all the protesters were funded by Iran.
Oh man! And
that just kind of washed away. Like it wasn't. If Shapiro had said the same thing, I think
it would have been far from game over. I mean, that almost seems like a politically damning statement if you were trying to advance anything in democratic politics, And I guess when I look at the enthusiasm for Walz right now, I wonder, I hate sometimes using the term the left, because I think anyone who's spent time around quote unquote the left realizes that no one knows what the left actually means. You actually have these very disparate groups of people. But in the 2018 AOC kind of era, it felt like you had Justice Democrats, DSA, Democratic Socialists for America, groups that were really identifying more with an actual left-wing ideology, seeming to have more clout within progressive politics. The enthusiasm from Walz feels like it's coming more from like the Working Families Party, the Elizabeth Warren, the policy wonk people who I'm sure would describe themselves as left wing. You could do that conventionally, but I would say probably more progressives. And again, in that vein of an Elizabeth Warren, has the progressive, liberal, left, if there's a different word you'd like to throw in there, throw it in, side of the Democratic Party, has that morphed in the last several years? And has that kind of been contributing to where you're seeing what is being generalized as, quote, left-wing enthusiasm for Walz?
Well, I think the expectations of the quote unquote left are so diminished that it's much easier for them to get excited now. Because they expect nothing. And so to get something, I think that was the reaction that you're seeing.
Yeah, like, oh my God, they did the thing that we wanted. Right. And I know I got several texts that were basically saying that, like, wow, they actually did, almost like they were ready to be outraged and now don't really know what to do today, and they're going to go and grab a sandwich or something.
Must be something wrong with this guy, yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, well, on that note, nobody is perfect, but I want to ask you, Ryan, on like an ending note, how people should think through some things. So Walz's history as governor, we've talked about the good legislation. There have been some moments. For example, he pushed back on a minimum wage mandate for Uber and Lyft drivers. He did the next year pass a compromise bill that raised their wages 20%. It did some sort of wonky stuff about how much you're getting paid per mile. There's instances where the Mayo Clinic, a hospital in Minnesota, one of his top donors, Walz had exempted the Mayo Clinic from a nurse staffing bill that had passed the House and Senate. Democrats in the state were a little bit disappointed. For a lot of people, that can sometimes come across as, oh man, is this guy not going to be a fighter? Is he just going where he sees kind of the popular thing happening? Someone who actually, you spend a lot of time covering politics and talking to different politicians. How should kind of a general person think through some of that? Because I think it's easy to get into binary sometimes, which is like, they did all these good things. Oh, they did these 3 bad things. And then it's like, oh, I guess they're not that cool. But, there's a lot more nuance. And in politics, it's actually impressive if anyone can get through everything that they want to without kind of watering it down. But that's, how I'm sort of reading that. But how do you take that stock? And does it influence the way we should consider and think about Walz?
Yeah, I actually thought both of those were pretty defensible from Walsh. Basically, Uber and Lyft put a gun to his head and said, if you pass this bill, we're out of here. And they had done that in the past. And so then the question is, are they telling the truth? Because as a governor, if you're responsible for Uber and Lyft leaving, like, you're going to get killed.
Absolutely.
People love Uber and Lyft.
Well, especially the drivers themselves are going to go, well, now what are we going to do?
Yeah, also the drivers themselves. Because, most of the drivers were not actively involved in the fight.
Yeah.
But also the passengers who were like, wait a minute. Because a lot of people, that's all they know now.
Sure. I mean, it would be politically toxic in a way to just be blamed for the lack of a transportation option in your state.
Yeah. And so he had to decide how serious they were. He ended up deciding they were serious. He blinked. They put the gun down. And to his credit there, usually what a politician will do there is they'll say, all right, we're going to come back with a compromised version. And then just nothing ever happens. And the industry wins. And in this case, they did come back with something that, went a distance toward raising wages without, driving up the cost so much that people got pissed off or Lyft and Uber squeezed the trigger on them. And then on the other one, it's the Mayo Clinic, man.
Well, I think it's in a similar vein. It's in a similar vein. It's a big employer. It's symbolically means a lot to your state. And again, the way that I thought about that is it's unsavory, but it's unfortunately how politics, as you've covered at the Intercept, now Drop Site, as we've covered at the Lever, big money and businesses, or the Mayo Clinic in this case, the giant nonprofits that are tax exempt, can control a lot of influence in your state, and they're aware of that.
Yeah, right. The bigger knock, and it's interesting, it's in a couple directions, is his response to the George Floyd riots. On the one hand, you've got the left, and I don't know enough about his response to get into the weeds on it. You'd want to talk to some, I think, Minnesota activists who I think would be enormously critical. He called out the National Guard. At the same time, from the right, people say that, his refusal to take more drastic action, allowed the protests to go on, far longer than they ever should have, and create a lot more damage and destruction than they should have otherwise. And actually, you've seen some centrist Democrats who are kind of begging people like me and you to attack him for bringing out the National Guard. Because then they think a normie voter will look at him as a tough governor. You see the bizarre ricochet politics they're trying to play on that. So and he has apologized. He said he did a terrible job, basically. But what does he mean? Does he mean he should have cracked down more? Does he mean he cracked down too much? Basically, I think he means that he didn't crack down enough. So that's there's a lot of room for criticism there. But it's interesting that you see it coming from both the left and the right, and they can't in some ways they can't both be correct. You can't be too hard and too soft.
You can't. Yeah, it's a funny dichotomy, but it does, I think, speak to that. Overall, I think the heart of the question, a lot of people on the left, progressives, really a lot of people just observing, we're kind of wondering, is this guy the real deal? And in many cases, it does seem like he has advanced this legislation. He has pushed for this legislation. Is that a fair read, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think he's the real deal. I think to have that slim of a majority and to push for that progressive of an agenda to get through and to get it done, is extremely unusual among Democratic politicians.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time. The website is Drop Site News. I encourage everyone listening to subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Thanks for taking the time out of your day and chatting with me.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with editing support from Joel Warner. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back later this week with another episode of Lever Time.